Hi, this is Sebastian Rushworth. Welcome to my podcast where I talk to the most interesting and original thinkers in health science. My guest today is Seamus O'Mahony, who is a physician located in Ireland and a specialist in gastroenterology. And over the last couple of years, Seamus has written a trilogy of books that have as an underlying theme what's broken with medicine and that discuss why we've ended up in this bizarre situation where medicine often harms patients rather than helping them. And in our conversation today, we discuss how we ended up in this situation. We talk about the many different ways in which modern medicine is broken, and we discuss what can potentially be done to fix the situation going forward. So please enjoy my conversation with Seamus O'Mahony. Hi, Seamus. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me today.
It's a pleasure. It's good to talk to you, Sebastian. Thank you for asking me.
So, your first book was The Way We Die Now. I think it came out in 2017, and it paints kind of a bleak picture of how people die in modern society. What motivated you to write that book?
It came about by accident. I hadn't planned to write a book, and the seeds of the book were sown some years before. Just to give you some background, I worked for many years in a big teaching hospital in the south of Ireland in Cork as a gastroenterologist and general physician. And in Ireland, I would imagine, unlike Sweden, even in big teaching hospitals, specialists like gastroenterologists would do a lot of what's called general medicine, which is predominantly the care of older people with multiple comorbidities. And I had this very difficult experience in, I think it was 2012, where for most of that year, I was looking after two patients, both of them for several months, and they overlapped for maybe a couple of months. But for most of 2012, I was looking after two patients. One, an elderly man with dementia and recurrent aspiration pneumonia, and the second, a younger man with decompensated alcoholic liver disease. Now, these are fairly typical patients I might have been looking after as inpatients in my job. But what made these cases unusually challenging was that in both cases, the families of the patients couldn't accept that they were going to die, that the patients were going to die, that their relative was going to die. And I found myself in this prolonged conflict with two families for nearly a whole year. Both patients eventually died. And I remember at the end of it, I sat down for a cup of coffee with a colleague of mine because both patients had spent some time in the intensive care unit. They were familiar with the patient as well, and in particular one intensive care physician. And we had found dealing with these families incredibly challenging and difficult. And we had a cup of coffee when it was all over, when both patients had eventually died. And we were talking about the experience of death and dying in acute hospitals. We were talking about how families, are very often in denial, how families collude with doctors to not talk openly with the patient about it. And at the end of this conversation, this intensive care doctor said, "Well, I'm organizing an intensive care conference. Would you like to come and give a talk about all of this?" So I said, okay, and I prepared my talk, which I gave to a sort of handful of people at the very end of a long intensive care conference. And at the end of it, I was going to write it up as, a paper perhaps for a journal. And while I was doing that, and when I started it occurred to me that I really wanted to write for a general readership, not just for doctors. And as I started this essay, I realized not long after I had got going that what I really wanted to write was a book. And that's how it started. So the book was written from the perspective of somebody like me working in an acute general hospital rather than somebody working, let's say, in hospice medicine, where most of these kind of books before that had come from. Now, I don't know what it's like in Sweden, but certainly in Ireland and the UK, more than half of all deaths take place in acute general hospitals, far more than in, hospices. So in Ireland, it would be, maybe 45, 50% of deaths would take place in acute general hospitals, maybe 4 or 5% in hospices. And I felt that this needed to be written about. There was a rather rosy picture of death and dying emerging from the hospice community. And I think what I wanted to say was, well, that's fine, but that's only where a small minority of deaths take place. I want to tell you about what really happens every day on the wards where I work, and it wasn't rosy. People were dying very often without knowing that they were dying. They were very often dying with invasive medical intervention right up to the very end. It wasn't what we would regard as a good death, and I think and that's what I wanted to get across, was that this is where the action is. This is where at least half of all deaths are taking place, and it's not very good. So that was the background to the book.
The situation is definitely similar here in Sweden. I mean, even very clearly palliative patients who are right at the end of life usually die in a hospital and not in a hospice setting. And I mean, I think it's common to have. I mean, just in the last few months, I've been in situations where I mean, it should be clear that the patient is dying and that they're going to die within the next few days, but where no kind of conversation about that is happening with the patient, and where we're still kind of asking the patient, well, do you still want us to do everything if your heart stops, even though it's clear that they're going to die and that no intervention is going to change that. So I mean, that kind of denial is definitely something we see here in Sweden as well.
Okay. And I think the problem was that these conversations about, you mentioned resuscitation. So these conversations about resuscitation, about escalation of care, about admission to ICU, and so on, these conversations were nearly always taking place at a time of crisis. They were taking place in the emergency department after some acute deterioration, which is the worst possible time to be having these conversations with both patients and families. And I noticed that amongst my colleagues, and I hold my hand up here, we were as bad in gastroenterology as oncology, for example, but there was this culture of not having these conversations, despite the fact that, doctors were, seeing patients who had a life-limiting disease, either an incurable cancer or an organ failure that was going to end in death and was not going to be curable, and transplant was not an option. There was never any suggestion that the doctor and the patient and the family might have a conversation outside a time of crisis, when they had time, and when there wasn't this awful emergency where you had to decide there and then, are we going to go to ICU? Are you going to have cardiopulmonary resuscitation? And every time these people were turning up at the outpatients, it was all about, oh, well, we'll order another scan, you'll have another round of chemo, we'll change around your medication. And there seemed to be this awful reluctance to engage in what I called in the book the difficult conversation. And I've come around to the view that it's not difficult, it should be called the essential conversation. And that this conversation should be a core duty of doctors, and it should be regarded as a right for the patient. And I think what I wanted to get across was that the whole culture of modern acute hospital medicine mitigated against you as a doctor having this conversation. The whole institutional setup and culture was all about avoiding this conversation. And then we were having hurried conversations at the worst possible time in the emergency department after an acute deterioration, when the patient is in no position to make informed decisions. Their families are stressed, often angry. And this is why, these conflicts were happening, because of this failure to have these conversations. And if I could, pick one takeaway message from my book for doctors, it would be, have this conversation, early in the course of the disease.
Why is there such a refusal to face mortality? Among patients and among their families, and among doctors as well. And do you think this is a new phenomenon, or has it always been this way?
Nowadays, we have this reluctance to talk about death because we live so long. We have an expectation, and justifiably, that we will live into our 9th or even 10th decades. Most of us are going to survive into what our ancestors would have regarded as extreme old age. And that's great. And that's a wonderful change in humankind. And it's a thing to be celebrated. But that has brought with it, in rich countries, high-income countries, a reluctance to consider one's mortality. And this is fed by medicine, which, this is getting on to my second book, I suppose, I've argued that we had this golden age in medicine of a period of about a half century, from the mid-30s to the mid-80s, where we had these dramatic and wonderful advances. We had this major increase in longevity, at least in high-income countries. But that brought with it an expectation that medicine could fix all sorts of things, and that old age was something to be pushed back more and more, that all diseases were ultimately fixable and curable. And that placed this sort of subconscious idea in the mind of the general population, or patients, their families, that we can fix a lot of things. And we have given, I think, as a profession, slightly unreasonable expectations as to what medicine can do. We can do wonderful things that we couldn't do, when my parents were growing up. My mother's brother died age 17 of spinal tuberculosis. She's now 89 and talks about him to this day. She talks about him all the time. He died 2 years before the first ever randomized controlled trial of streptomycin was published by the British Medical Journal. So that was what life was like for my mother's generation when they were teenagers. And all of that changed dramatically in, a few decades. So a disease like tuberculosis, which was killing tens of thousands of people a year in Ireland, was suddenly treatable and curable in most people. But we're reluctant now to talk about that in old age. Most of us are going to experience for at least 2 years running up to death, loss of independence, experience of chronic disease, and so on. And we're reluctant to talk about these things. And we believe, when I say we, people in high-income countries believe in fairy tales like the compression of morbidity, that we're going to live until we're 95 in wonderful health, and then we're going to fall off our perch after running a marathon the day before. And we're reluctant to talk about the reality of old age, the reality of um, uh, nursing homes, the reality of how life ends for most of us.
You mentioned your second book, and the title of this book was "Can Medicine Be Cured? The Corruption of a Profession." I guess that might be considered quite an aggressive title for a book. What motivated you to write that book?
I think that was a natural progression from the first book. So I had criticized in the first book what I would call the biotechnological paradigm of medicine, which during my professional lifetime, which spans, from the 1983 to now, has been the dominant paradigm within medicine. And I was part of all of this. I believed in this very much. I bought into it. And this paradigm achieved a great deal during this kind of golden age. But I felt that in dealing with the dying and in dealing with people whose problems could not be cured, that it was a paradigm that didn't work. And I wanted to explore why this was. And I'd also been among and within academic medicine. I wasn't a full-time academic, but I was involved in research on and off for a long time. I worked with full-time academics. And as I grew older and progressed in my career, I became increasingly skeptical about what academic medicine was about. And I wanted to write about where I felt research had lost its way. I wanted to write about where I felt the frontline doctors were being led astray, were being let down by their academic leaders. I felt medicine had been hijacked also by commercial interests, pharma and others. I felt that clinical doctors like myself, frontline clinical doctors, increasingly did not have a voice. We were being, told by the academic doctors who drew up these guidelines, this is what you'll be doing. Now on you go. There's a good chap. Keep quiet and do what you're told. And I suppose I wanted to give a view from the front line of medicine about what I felt was going on. I increasingly lost respect and regard for academic medicine. But I didn't want to place myself in, the conspiracy theory tent. I believe in evidence-based medicine, even though it has been hijacked by and large by commercial interests. But I believe in the scientific method. I don't believe in complementary medicine. I mean, fine, by all means. I say to my patients, if it helps you, and if it helps you with a condition for which mainstream medicine can do little, if you've got chronic fatigue or irritable bowel syndrome, fine. And if it helps you, go and use it by all means. But, I believe in scientific medicine. I believe in the scientific process, evidence-based medicine. But I felt that it had been hijacked and that it had lost its way. I felt that academic medicine was all about careers rather than science or medicine. I thought in rich countries we had lost a connection with our own mortality. And these were the sort of themes that I wrote about in the second book.
The way you describe it in the book, it sounds like doctors have gone from having this broader role as healers to this much narrower role as technicians. Yeah. Is that kind of a natural consequence of the fact that medicine has just become better, that we've become more technically proficient, and so we've kind of been able to focus on the technical part of the job and ignore these broader issues, or is there something else that's been kind of driving that?
Yeah, no, you're right. The fact that we can do things that we couldn't do, the technical side of the job has become far more important than the pastoral side of the job. When, before the golden age of medicine was largely ineffective. So, the pastoral side of the job was virtually everything. Doctors had to be really good at that side of things because there was so little they could do. So within my speciality now, for example, you spend all your day doing endoscopy and doing clinics, and so your thoughts are all about what is my what is my polyp detection rate this week? Right, does this patient need a biological agent? And so on and so on and so on. And the more technological development there is, the more it takes over all this other side of the job. And it took me decades for the penny to drop, which was what people had been saying for centuries, before I qualified. And I didn't realize it until late in my career, that the most important thing that you bring to the job as a doctor is not your polyp detection rate, and it's not the paper you published in gastroenterology. It's your presence. It's actually just being there. It's just being there, even if there's nothing you can do. And I decided, towards when I was a very senior physician at this stage, that if any of my patients were dying, I told the juniors, call me. I want to go over and just be there. Doesn't matter what, I was doing nothing. I couldn't, change the trajectory of this event. But afterwards, the families would say, you were there. You were there. And that made a huge difference to people. And it's astonishing that it took me so long to realize this very simple truth about what we do, because my mind was so taken up with polyp detection rates and my ERCP list, and how many people were turning up to the clinic. And I think doctors in acute hospitals, particularly in specialities like, oncology, gastroenterology, chest medicine, we spend all our time fretting about the technology, about the intervention, about the procedures, that we fret so much about these things, and our minds are so taken up with these things that we forget the simple things that previous generations of doctors regarded as the center and focus of what doctoring was all about. And I'm not putting down the technology. If I have acute cholangitis from a bile duct stone, I want a good ERCPist to remove that bile duct stone. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this is, the technology is important, but we've made it too important in a way at the expense of other things. And we've pushed technological intervention beyond to a stage where it is of little or no benefit, to a point where it's actually inflicting harm.
One of the things you talk about in your book is how medical research has, partly how it's been hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry and commercialized, and you contrast that with how most of the useful research done during this golden era of medicine from the 40s to 80s was really done by kind of amateurs or amateur doctors working with the shoestring budgets, and now instead we have the pharmaceutical industry expending billions and with very little to show for it. And you also talk about how medical research has kind of become a game where the purpose is more to produce papers and again improve your metrics as a researcher, and how it's really become a game to further careers rather than generate any kind of useful knowledge. How did we end up in this mess? And is there a way for research to change direction?
Yeah. I started this by looking at a book that I had in my office for years. So this book was a collection of papers published by the British Society of Gastroenterology on the occasion of their Golden Jubilee meeting in 1987, which I attended in London. It was the first big conference I was ever at. I had a poster at it. And they put together this collection of papers from the 1937 to 1987 of the most influential publications over that 50 years. And as you say, very often huge advances were achieved by amateurs, and I mean amateur in the best sense of the word. These were enthusiasts who worked without huge research grants, who very often worked in small groups on their own, or maybe one or two people. So just for example, in vitro fertilization, moving slightly away from my speciality, was developed by an obstetrician who worked in a district general hospital in Oldham in the north of England, far away from teaching hospitals and so on. He collaborated with a physiologist based in Cambridge. So people in these very often, unglamorous clinical posts very often achieved a lot. I think people like Austin Bradford Hill, these great statisticians, had a lot to do with it as well. Where did we go wrong? I think what happened was a combination of things. The pharmaceutical industry grew in power and influence in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when they got the blockbuster drugs, particularly. So I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Zantac, ranitidine, became one of the first blockbuster drugs. And these drugs were a sort of paradigm shift. you make an antibiotic, a patient gets it for a week. You make Zantac in the pre-Helicobacter era, and indeed in the post-Helicobacter era, people were on it for decades. So these drugs changed the whole model for pharma. These drugs like Zantac, Lipitor, the antihypertensive, so on, the drugs that the patient would be on forever and ever and ever. So the blockbuster drugs changed the landscape in pharma. So that was one thing. The second thing was academic medicine. So when I started, let's say a professor of medicine would be a primus inter pares, a clinician who led other clinicians and was respected as a clinician and a teacher. And that model finished sometime in the 80s, early 90s. And senior academics became people who ran laboratories, who produced papers, and most importantly, got in grant money. So that model, which came in, a lot from America, but also in the post-war era in Britain, gradually took over the old model of the medical academic as a clinician, a teacher, and a leader. So this new model came in, and very often the new model professor of medicine, did little or no clinical work. And I remember I worked as a senior registrar in the UK, and a very eminent professor retired while I was there. So he was a very famous hepatologist, very eminent man, but a clinician first and foremost. When he went, a molecular biologist who did no clinical work whatsoever and who ran a huge research group took over. So that change was symbolic of what was happening in academic medicine. So you had these people who were effectively running what many people would regard as a Ponzi scheme. So they have all these postdocs doing the actual work for them. So it's a sort of pyramid scheme. And getting back to metrics, they're judged on publication metrics, their H-index, their citation count, and so on and so on. So there are perverse incentives. At the top, then, it's about generation of grant income. So medical academics are incentivized to publish, to keep publishing, to publish in high-impact journals. The molecular paradigm then took over. So laboratory research came to be viewed as more valuable than clinical research. And it was easy to produce loads of papers. Once you had a new technique, then you could apply it to all sorts of things. So this new Brahminate took over academic medicine, essentially. And they went into partnership, essentially, with pharma, and they became incredibly influential in clinical practice through the production of guidelines and protocols. So even though they themselves did little or no clinical work, what happened on the wards in the clinics was very much dictated by them. And I feel that this particular class of people needed to be challenged as to what they were doing. And I challenged their leadership within medicine. And I didn't accept their leadership.
And do you think there's a way to fix research so that it starts being productive again, or is it more just the fact that in the 40s to 80s there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, and now we've done all the easy stuff, and all additional progress is going to be inch by inch, and each inch is going to cost $1 billion?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Progress is now going to be incremental. You're right. The low-hanging fruit was picked in the golden age, in that time. But I think we have to ask ourselves a more fundamental question as a society, and that is, what do we want research to achieve? What is it there for? Is it there to cure all diseases? Should we fund biogerontology? Should we fund research into decelerating and preventing the aging process? And these are very fundamental philosophical questions for us as a species. When we face a climate crisis, is there advantage to humans living to be 150 in this world? We have to ask ourselves these questions. And these are very fundamental, existential, philosophical questions that go beyond medical research. So I think we have to ask these questions. I mean, if you go to each group of researchers and you ask them, well, what is your aim with research? Oh, it's to cure disease. So you're going to cure. Well, if you ask each individual group, they'll say the same thing. So we appear to be on a mission to cure all diseases. Is this wise? Is this something that we want as a species, or is this good for the planet? Is this good for the sustainability even of us, let alone the planet? And these are questions we need to ask. On the other hand, could research focus on making the lives we have better and more tolerable? Could research focus on the alleviation of suffering? Have we forgotten as a profession that our core mission actually is not the prevention of death, but the alleviation of suffering? Could we focus a little bit more on that? And, getting back to evidence-based medicine, I quoted a philosopher of science in the book who wrote about evidence-based medicine, who said, yes, it's been hijacked by commercial interests and pharma, but that doesn't invalidate evidence-based medicine as a method. And he wrote, and he made the analogy that if we made decisions on the basis of reading palms, the pharmaceutical industry would learn how to influence palm readers. Okay? So I'm not against evidence-based medicine. I'm not against science. But I do think that we have to ask fundamental questions about what is research for.
One of the things that comes again in all three of your books is this idea that that one of the things that characterizes modern medicine is aggressive overtreatment, often with drugs that produce little to no benefit and often significant harms. Why do you think doctors behave in this way towards patients?
I don't know. I don't know if you've been following a case of an oncologist, an academic oncologist in England called Justin Stebbing, very senior academic oncologist. And I've been following the case because I've been particularly critical of oncology and the culture of oncology. It was one of the things that fed into the first book. I was picking up patients who had been through oncology and discarded by them. And I was picking them up and I was astonished at the expectation that had been placed in the patient's minds and the family's minds of what treatment was going to provide. And I was having to tell them, I'm really sorry, but no, that chemotherapy, was never meant to cure you, and now you're dying. And now you're my responsibility. So I admit openly, and I have admitted, that I have a problem with oncology as a culture, contemporary oncology. I have a serious problem with it. Anyway, this guy, Justin Stebbing, has been through a prolonged process with the General Medical Council, the main body that regulates doctors in Britain, and has been found guilty in pretty much all charges. And he is a sort of an extreme example of the culture of oncology, but he was getting people from all over Britain and all over the world. He was known as Dr. God because he would tell them, I can cure you. So people would come to him, very famous, wealthy people in particular, who had been told, by their own doctors, look, I don't think there's much more I can do for you. You need to engage with palliative care, the usual conversation. But he told them, he told a lot of people, no, I will, I can do something for you. So he's the sort of an extreme example of this culture within oncology. And one of the things that emerged during his hearing with the General Medical Council, somebody gave evidence saying that he had a real problem with death and dying. He could not accept it. He had an emotional, almost allergic response to even thinking about it, let alone talking or discussing it. And this guy was
probably not a good idea to become an oncologist.
Yeah.
Then that feels like the worst possible specialization.
Well, I'm astonished at what's going on in oncology. Maybe certainly it's going on in Ireland, where there is this gung-ho, incredibly interventionist approach, a very American model of oncology, giving these incredibly expensive drugs with incredibly marginal benefits, and then placing in the minds of patients and their families this expectation that it's going to do something. And I'm struggling to get inside the mind, but this guy had a great difficulty with death. He also, I think, got off, if I can use that word. He gained emotionally from the hero worship that was directed at him by these patients, because they would, the worst phrase that for doctors is, "Doctor, you're my last hope." When people would come in saying that, I knew I was in trouble, and I knew I would have to be talking them down and their families. When people come, "You're my last hope." But for some oncologists, this guy in particular, I think this gave him this kind of emotional boost. He was giving intensive chemotherapy to people within the last weeks of their lives. But it's interesting that he has yet to be sanctioned, so we don't know if he's going to be struck off. I don't know what sanction he will get, but he has been found guilty on virtually all charges against him. So his case might be a turning corner in oncology, for example. Why? But it's not just oncology; it's right across. It's right across medicine. I've noticed people in my own speciality. So, for example, peg tubes, when they first came in the 90s, peg tubes were being put into patients without any assessment by a gastroenterologist. And I used to say, I'm sorry, whoa. I'm a physician. I'm not a technician. I actually have to think about, is this the right thing to do? And doctors and families who were referring patients to me for peg tubes used to get quite annoyed that I felt, I'm sorry, but I actually have to make a call here on whether this is the right thing to do for this patient. And actually, I wrote quite a bit about peg tubes and the ethics of it. Actually, this was kind of what got me into writing about death and dying, because peg tube insertion was very often in the context of end-of-life care. But routinely, patients were being referred to me for peg insertion who had advanced dementia. And I spent a lot of time explaining to families there's no benefit in peg tube feeding in advanced dementia. And I spent even more time talking to the doctors, the geriatricians, the oncologists, the neurologists about all of these things. And a lot of them were quite irritated that I was taking this line. A lot of them were taking this sort of, well, why don't you just get on and do the job? You're a technician. I just want you to put in the damn peg tube. Why are you giving me a lecture on philosophy and end-of-life care? Who the hell are you? Just be a technician. So I would say, look, I'm sorry, I'm not a technician. Well, I am a technician, but I'm a physician first and foremost. And they would stop asking me, and they'd go off to some other doctor who was very happy to be a technician. So, but I was that kind of rare thing, the thinking gastroenterologist, because my speciality had been taken over by endoscopy. So we stopped thinking when endoscopy became the main thing that we did. We stopped saying, well, is this the right thing to do? The question we asked instead was, can I do it? And if so, how many of them can I do in one list? That was the questions we were routinely asking. So I came at all of these questions from, within, gastroenterology, within academic medicine. So in a way, I was a traitor to all of the sort of the cultures that I was brought up to believe in. But I thought it was better that somebody like me was writing about these issues rather than a palliative care doctor, somebody that was within all of this culture. And I've been pleasantly surprised after the 3 books that a lot of people within medicine, within gastroenterology, within even oncology have written to me or emailed me or spoken to me saying, I completely agree with what you're saying. So if there's a groundswell of people who believe like me, then maybe I'm not alone, and maybe there is something within medicine that we need to change. But I think the frontline doctors have been disempowered. They've lost their voice. There's a sort of the academic people have taken over the power and influence within medicine, and I think we need to pull that power back.
So we've been talking for a while now. I'm conscious that we should wrap up. I just want to talk a little bit about your final book, The Ministry of Bodies. So I assume the title was chosen as a kind of homage to the House of God. It feels too similar to just have been chosen at random.
No, it wasn't an homage to the House of God. In fact, I had occasion to read. I hadn't read the House of God ever until a couple of years ago, because I was asked to review the follow-up to it. So Samuel Shem wrote a follow-up a couple of years ago, and I was asked to review it, and I thought, well, I can hardly review it if I haven't read the original, The House of God. I really didn't like The House of God, I'll be perfectly honest. If you read it now, it's unbelievably sexist, quasi-pornographic, and the follow-up was even worse. So I didn't like it. No, it wasn't an homage to the House of God. The book title was actually not mine. I was commissioned to write a book by my publisher, by my editor, Neil Belton, at Head of Zeus, who's edited all my books. And Neil asked me after the second book, would I write a book about a year, any random year, in the life of a general hospital? And it was Neil actually chose the title. So ministry has 2 meanings. I guess it means a ministry is a sort of a bureaucracy, which gets back to all this, managerialism we've talked about. A ministry is a building, and a ministry means a sort of a vocation or like a priestly function, the ministry. So it had all of these meanings, and I thought it was a good title. I liked it. So I started taking notes, for the book early in the summer of 2019, and after 3 months of taking notes, I realized, or I know I made the decision that I was exhausted and that I was going to retire. So what became a random year initially became, this is my last year ever at the front line. This is my last year of doing this. So that gave me this incredible freedom to write about what it's like, how badly people can and do behave, my colleagues, the managers, because I knew I was going. I knew it was my last year. So it gave it that extra kind of power, I think. In the end, I finished up. So I started taking notes in June 19. My last working day was the 7th of February 20. COVID was christened 4 days later. So its timing was both good and terrible. I think in retrospect actually good, because it just describes the very end of that career when I was clearly exhausted, absolutely burnt out. You know, um, um, and that's what the book describes. And I'm not at all ashamed to admit that. I'm not at all ashamed to write as honestly as I did. People say to me, "Can you walk down the street in Cork now?" I mean, after what you wrote about, I said, "I don't care. I'm glad I wrote it. I'm glad that somebody wrote it, and this is what goes on. This is the truth." And in fact, I've said some of the monsters in the book are pale imitations of the people who inspired them. I had to pull back on it. It's actually worse. The reality was actually in some ways worse. So I'm glad that I wrote it. I think the timing was good. It was my last year. Yes, I was exhausted. I'm not afraid to admit that. I hate this current narrative that doctors are being told who are working in intolerable situations that, the problem actually is that you're not resilient enough. If only you went to a few workshops on resilience training, you'd be fine and you wouldn't be complaining in the way that you do. And there's nothing at all wrong with all this, metrics-driven managerialism, and everything in medicine is fine. It's not. And I'm not only glad that I wrote the book, I'm proud that I wrote it. And I'm glad that I had the honesty and the strength to write as I did. A lot of doctors, particularly doctors of my generation, have written to me saying, "Yeah, you're right. This is what goes on." A lot of people have hated the book. I wrote about some sort of patients with functional diseases. I think I got a lot of, I don't read a lot of stuff online, but you get the sort of the odd kind of. I look at the odd snippet, and some people absolutely hated it. So it's a Marmite book. Some people loved it, some people hated it. I'm glad I wrote it. I'm glad that it's there as a document of what medicine was like and is like. I'm glad it's there, So I think for the 3 books, if you wanted a picture of what medicine was and is like in the early 21st century, I think it's there. And I'm kind of proud to have written them. So I'm leaving all of that now, and I'm writing a new book on something completely different. I'm writing about the history of psychoanalysis. So a complete sort of departure. So I'm leaving those books behind, which I regard really as a trilogy because they're interconnected. The themes developed throughout the 3 books, and I'm leaving them there, I think, as a document and a legacy of my career and my work. And I'm going to hopefully branch off. Well, the new book is certainly a departure in something quite different, and I'm enjoying very much writing it and researching it. So that's going to come out, I hope, maybe late next year. So that's my current project, and I'm working as a vaccinator. So it's a different life, but this combination of working in a vaccine center and writing is an agreeable life, and I'm enjoying it. Yeah.
Well, I hate Marmite, but I loved your book. And I loved all 3 of your books, to be honest. But what I really like about the Ministry of Bodies is it manages to be both funny and serious at the same time, and I mean that's quite a difficult combination to pull off. So, well, I'm excited to hear you're writing a new book, and I look forward to reading that as well. So, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation with me.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thanks for asking me. Okay, thank you.
Guess what? The full-length version of this interview is roughly twice as long. In order to get access to the full-length version, you'll need to sign up as a patron, which you can do at patreon.com/Sebastian Rushworth. Patrons get access to a private podcast feed with full-length versions of all the interviews I do. They also get access to my private forum and all the interesting conversations happening there. And they gain the ability to send me direct messages. I always respond to messages from my patrons. So please sign up at patreon.com/Sebastian Rushworth.